to Pivot Point of View. I'm Destry Millsap, and Becky is on the road today, who normally co-hosts with me. So just going to be me today. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Austin Doby. He's a vet, and he does a great job. So I'm very excited to have him on here. And Dr. Doby, do you want to tell people a little bit about where you came from and your schooling and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. First, thanks for having me. Those of you that don't know me, I grew up in North Carolina. My dad has a cattle ranch. We grew up doing that. We had horses. Uh, Started out, we rode quite a bit. Then got started with the barrel horses after that. I did my undergrad at North Carolina State. I was a scholar there. Much to my parents' displeasure, I moved to Oklahoma to go to vet school. That way I could keep pursuing the horse fraternities and everything else because it was a little hard to transfer back and forth so much with school going on. And I've kind of been here ever since.
You've been our vet for a while, and we absolutely appreciate everything you do for us. And one of the reasons that we came to you is because you have your own horse program. You grew up in this industry, whether it be the roping, the barrel racing. You've been around all of it. You understand it. You train your own horses, and just being from that background, somebody that has been in it and understands what's going on from that perspective, from being in it. So talk a little bit about your horse program that you have.
So predominantly now we just start a lot of futurity horses. I like to traditionally I always just bought yearlings and kind of the fall and started them as 2-year-olds through the winter, and we kind of go through them. And anybody that's in the industry at a high level will tell you, you start with a lot, and it doesn't mean that that they're not good horses, but we're all looking for a Michael Jordan or a Kobe Bryant to take to the futurities because those are the horses that win. So we start a bunch of them, and then for me, my goal originally with the futurity horses was for it to be profitable. So when we would start them, I would get them going, and then we would kind of sell them as good riding 2-year-olds or lightly started on the pattern, and that helped pay for a lot of vet school. And then there was a couple we ran across that I thought, man, this is a really just standout horse. I would like to keep it in the program, and we would keep those and run those ourselves. I think probably the one that people remember the most would be a Babe. Kind of a funny story about her was I bought her just to kind of start and resell. I was kind of broke at the time. And we got her started, and I called my dad and I said, Dad, I really like this one. I think she's special. And so he hadn't saw her. He came out for college graduation. I graduated vet school. It was the first time I saw her. And the day that morning before we went to graduation, I cruised all the colts through I had at the house. And I was so proud of her as a 3-year-old. And I stepped off of her, and he's like, I think that's the best one you probably trained. You should sell her now. And I looked at him and I was like, well, I want to keep this one. I don't have to pay for school anymore. And he said, you're too big. You can't ride her. She's not big enough for you. So I kept her whole 3-year-old year to his displeasure. And then I'd called my dear friends here at Chapman that day after graduation. I said, hey, I've got this 3-year-old. I think she's great. I don't know if she'll be fast enough. I said, but she doesn't make a mistake. She's just an outstanding individual. So Sierra picked her up 2 weeks before the juvenile, and she placed second juvenile there and went on had a very successful futurity career. But that's kind of like, I think the horse that like really turned a big part in my program was it taught me more than anything is that even though you have great horses, you have to put them in the right hands or know which person can do the best with them. And she did an outstanding job there. And it just made me take a step back because now, like, when I have horses, if I think somebody else would be more successful with them, I try to get them to their hands because doing the vet stuff, I don't get to go as much as I would like to, but it's made the program a lot more successful just in that one horse. I think is what we kind of built the program around.
What kind of things, when you're looking for that next level horse, what are the type of conformational things and stuff like that that you look for in them young colts because their bodies haven't fully matured, and so as they come up and they grow, what are you looking for in them horses?
So typically I try to pick out yearlings, long yearlings coming 2 year olds. It's hard. I think we all now pay a lot of attention to pedigree just because of the incentives. It costs just as much time and money to train one to be able to have those opportunities to run at the incentive money as not. So I try to capitalize on that. Conformationally, the things I look at, I like a low set hawk. I think those horses typically are a little more balanced to their stop. I look for a clean throat latch and how their neck ties in. I'd prefer one to tie in higher than lower. Those horses tend to generally be a little quicker through their shoulders, coming through themselves than a horse that ties in a little bit lower. They get a little heavier. And legs, I think just because what I do for a living, I'm OCD about legs. They have to be straight. I don't like them turned out, turned in, just because of the extra stress it puts on everything. I mean, there's no magic recipe, I don't think, for picking out prospects, because sometimes I pick some that I thought this is going to be a great one, and then there's others I'm like, well, I think this one will be all right, and it turns out the other one that I thought was just going to be all right turns out to be great. I think some people have a natural ability for it, and some of us just have to work really hard and get a little lucky every now and then.
Your program, as you bring them up from a yearling to 2 year old and stuff, what are some of the things that you like to do in your process? What's your process for those horses as you bring them up?
So now we raise a couple babies now because we've got a few mares that have won a little bit that I thought were successful, and I really like them. The yearlings, when we buy them, really I don't do much with them until about October of their yearling year, and then I like to get them up in the barn, start giving them a bath, tying them up, sacking them out, doing stuff like that. Usually by December, we're driving them in the round pen with long driving reins. And then I try to start riding them by January. Uh, in the perfect world, I like for all my 2 year olds to be broke by the time it's time to work calves.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good test to see how good of a job did you do, and B, how do they handle the stimulus and the pressure? Because when you're going towards the futurities, it's a lot of it is how they accept information quickly, and how do they handle stressful situations that you can't really prepare them for 100% of the time. I mean, we do the best we can, but inevitably you need a horse that kind of looks to you when they're a situation they don't know what to do, instead of just reacting. And you'll find out real quick when you start moving calves through pens, uh, how they're going to handle stress.
And I know that growing up when we had our own horse program, our horses earned their way to the arena. I mean, we would start them as 2 year olds, ride them, 2, 3, 4 year olds, and then if they were making it, we'd bring them to the arena and keep going with them. But going and ranching on them was a big part of that, and you can really figure out what your horse is made of. Like you said, I mean, you go in the Brandon pen with one, and there's
Yeah.
mass chaos. There's ropes going everywhere. There's people running everywhere as you drag them out. Brandon irons and all that stuff. Guys running around with vaccines. I mean, I took a colt to this one branding. They had generators and extension cords for their Brandon irons running every direction, and
Yeah.
my colt just handled it somehow. I mean, and I knew it wasn't our first branding we'd ever been to, but it was the first one like that, and so
Yeah.
just exposing them to that type of thing. You're right, giving them something to look at that might put them in a stressful situation and just see how they handle it. And some of them don't bat an eye at it, and those ones are always really good to haul when you start rodeoing and stuff. And then some of them have meltdowns and won't do it, and those are a lot tougher to bring along.
Those that don't handle the stress early, I think they still make good horses. As 5 and 6 year olds, usually they just for the futurity game, it just doesn't. It's not conducive because we have to go so quick.
Talk a little bit about uh, you know, that timeline for the futurity stuff. What milestones do you like to have them at as a 3 and 4 year old before you start entering them?
So I kind of just ride them after their 2 year old year. I ride them. We check a lot of fence. We move cattle. Just get them out of their arena for probably 6 months after they're really what I consider broke, where they'll lope, circle, stop, step through their self, counter arc. After you get them broke, I just get them out and let them be a horse and just relax and realize like every day I'm not gonna pick on you and ask you to do it a certain way. You just need to get comfortable going to work, whatever that is, whether it's long trotting fence or checking herd. Like you just got to be comfortable with whatever we do. I usually start. I think I go really slow compared to a lot of people. I usually start messing with them on the pattern around August of their 2-year-old year, September, just trotting them through. And I try to get them to where they'll do it perfect every time before we speed up. And to me, perfect means you're putting your feet in the spot you need to put them when we go fast without me micromanaging you and doing it for you or holding your shoulder up. I just want to be accountable before we ever add speed. I want them to learn accountability first. And then some of them pick it up really quick. Some of them, like a horse that's a little lazier, I tend to struggle with because they tend to want to take a shortcut here or there, or they'll kind of quit moving through the turn. So I do that. And then through the winter, I just keep piddling with them and start adding them. And I try to have them loping through the pattern really nice by December, like maybe half speed or so, just catching their leads, holding their leads their turn, and just try to get them to do it on their own. Because 10 years ago, if you asked me, I would have told you, oh, I can get one pattern really quick, and I still can. But it's different when you're doing everything for them versus taking the time to teach them to be accountable and do it for themselves. Sometimes you can get by doing a lot for them and helping them, but when you get to a certain level that you're trying to compete at, those horses, they do it on their own. I mean, you might have to help them here or there, but you're not doing it for them. And for me personally, like at the end of the maturity year, we like to sell those horses to buy more for the coming year and then to go on and have a long, successful career. So I try to get them to where they're really accountable early. And then about May of their 3-year-old year, I'll start looking at the clock. I like to haul them probably earlier than I should. Like if there's an empty hole on the trailer, I'm filling it with something. Like whether that horse just stands tied to the trailer, or we go lope around the warm up pen. Like if there's an empty hole, I'm filling it with something with those colts just to get them used to going and seeing. If we're going to like a show, we're there for a couple of days. It does. I mean, I'm bad about just taking 2 or 3-year-olds just to take and ride around and maybe exhibition a couple of times, just to get, because I think you can really learn a lot in the early part of it, hauling them. Like, does this horse eat good on the road, or do you need to do something different, or does this horse stress when it goes on the road? Like, it's easier to figure those things out early in their 3-year-old year before you really start dialing them in around July, trying to get them to step up and clock and get them ready for the fall futurities. If you already know the ins and outs of that individual, that I think that's one thing that helps me a lot. I don't keep 30 head in training. I only try to have 3 or 4 really that I go all the way to the futurities with each year, and usually that honestly ends up being 1 or 2, just because I am so selective of the specific individual I'm looking for. But that's kind of my program. And then once we get to the futurities, it's a gunfight. Like it's whoever has the most luck that day, because there's a lot of great horses there. There's a lot of great trainers there. It just going and competing at that level, like it's just exciting. Like you don't ever know who's going to win.
There's so many great horses out there, so many great bloodlines. The incentive deal, those bloodlines are just breeding amazing horses and high powered and getting better and better all the time. You mentioned letting them figure it out themselves and figure out how to hold themselves through the barrel right themselves instead of having to do it for them. And so that sounds like a good way to maybe help prevent injury.
Oh, I definitely think it plays a huge role in that. I mean, if they're projecting mentally of where they need to put their feet and place them on their own, they're going to be way more efficient through the turn and use their body in a way that doesn't have the torque on it, as if you went in there and you like were they didn't know what step was coming next, so to speak. If they're choosing to place their own feet, they're going to be way more efficient and not hurt themselves as much. They have to be more balanced to do it on their own.
Right, and putting that foundation on them early, where they learn to take care of themselves and handle the ground.
Yeah, I think we're kind of spoiled at the futurities because the ground's usually really good. I think it does help them later down the road as they go to be a rodeo horse for somebody. Um, at the futurities, the grounds they try to do such a good job. It doesn't always come out 100%, but they really do put their best effort into it. But I think it does make them probably more versatile. If it's a little more sandy or a little wetter, I think they just probably do handle it better, in my opinion. But for us, I think we're kind of spoiled. It's not like we're going to a rodeo. I think one thing that's um, Jolene, I think probably talks about it more openly than other trainers. But a horse's true fitness, like that, I think that plays a bigger role probably than anything else we do is how fit that horse is for the job we're asking it to do. Like the futurity horses, we keep them really conditioned. They're in training, they're getting rode. I think they're fitter in their futurity year than any other year of their life for the most part. But I think the fitter we have these horses and we train them to the conditions that they're going to compete at, um, the more likely you are to prevent injuries. Like you don't hear a lot of people talking about freezing a horse or galloping them out, but when we run barrels, we ask them to go as fast as their feet can go. So why we need to work at that pace that, I mean, it's a little scientific, but that VO2 max, if you will, uh, for their cardiovascular capacity, we need to work at that pace for their bone development, tendon remodeling, or sorry, bone remodeling and tendon development when they're young, so they can handle it throughout their life. Um, and that's a lot of physiology that I think we don't talk about as much because it is kind of scientific, but I think it does play a big role in these horses' careers longevity.
Yeah, I mean, in the sports world, we train our athletes in sport specific movements with sport specific drills at sport specific speeds. And it's no different for the horse world. You have to train your horse for that event and the demands placed on it. And like you got to ask them to give that effort and train them in that anaerobic system,
Mm-hmm.
or going fast and develop conditioning that way rather than just the long trotting or loping circles or stuff.
Right.
No, you like ask them for you got to ask them for it so they can condition at that speed too, because that's what they're going to be doing in the arena. And I agree with you. I think it makes a big difference in just training the different muscle fibers that go along with that as well, the
Sure.
fast twitch, the slow twitch. And so it's there's a lot of crossover there between the human and horse world as far as training one. Um, what are some of the things that you do in order to make sure that your horses are fit and ready for that?
I think, well, we do long trot a lot. I like it. It's a good warm up. It really gets the muscles firing. I think as a horseman or a trainer, I think one thing you can do that makes a huge, significant difference in any individual, whether it's a rope horse, a barrel horse, cutting horse, any type of performance horse, is keeping their rib cage picked up. Um, Not only does it make them more balanced, but it builds their core strength if you can kind of keep their core picked up, their belly sucked up to their back. I think that when you work on that on those horses when you're conditioning them, they get softer in the bridle, their head comes down, their shoulders stay up. It's easier for them to get in a stop and gather up. If you ask them to step through their stuff, they're already collected there. And when I say collected, I mean if I want to turn right, I can turn my shoulders right and the horse turns right. Or if I like look to the left, the horse will look to the left and step around because they're in a balanced position. Like if you think like a human athlete, they say on your toes and like in a ready position. Like if you're in baseball and you're in the infield, you're on your toes, you got your glove down, you're ready for the play. I think it teaches those horses to keep a posture that it's ready for the next move. Um, Besides that, we do gallop them. Uh, at least 2 days a week. We'll just gallop them. I have a little straight line. It's not a track; it's just a straight line. We'll just gallop them up and down through there. And I'm not asking them for their life, but I'm asking them to reach out and work a little bit. And then when we do work in the arena, I do work them in the smaller circles for what we do because we are working in smaller circles at a high intensity. I think if you can't do it at a moderate intensity, then you probably can't do it at a high intensity. And I don't overdo it, but I do it enough that it's triggering development and response. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my thoughts on for what we do. I mean, for you know, for like if you have a rope horse, I think, working on things for like if it's a head horse, like working on strength for pulling and how they engage and keeping their back grounded when they're pulling and stuff. I think stuff like that would be important. It's all like you said, sport specific because each movement we're asking them specific to that sport.
The brokest horse wins. And so not only are you giving your horse more buttons and making them more broke, but you're also building their core up, training the muscles that they need for that specific movement and to be able to do it under control at a high rate of speed, something that can come back to you when you need it to, going at those high rates of speed instead of them pushing on you, getting off balance, and that's kind of when the injuries start to happen.
For sure, for sure. Anytime those horses get off balance or they start leaning through the turn, or I think you hear a lot of people talking about them dropping their shoulder, like that puts so much more stress on their front end that it's incredible they don't get more sore than they do.
Whenever you're bringing one along, when do you feel like they're ready to go faster? I mean, you just progress at speeds where you're like, okay, they did it correct at this speed. Now we can ramp it up a notch at the next exhibition or something like that.
So I think you answered the question the way you ask it. I think it's a feel. Like some horses, you know, it from an objective answer to answer the question, I think when you can do it consistently right 3 or 4 times with ease and not having to manufacture it, then you can ask them for a little bit more. But with that said, it's a lot of feel with what you feel in that individual because they're all different. I mean, it's just like kids. Some kids, you ask them to do something and they're not challenged enough, so they're not really paying attention. You don't have their focus because it's easy for them. Others, you really have to break things down and be like very simple with how you explain it until they get the hang of it. I think with these young horses, it just has a feel, like when it feels right and it feels easy, then it's time to add a little bit more. But I don't think you can say, oh, it has to do it right 5 times or, like I don't think you can put like a set number on it. A lot of it comes from feel. Because like I had one horse 7 years ago, and I thought this is the laziest, like slow-footed thing I've ever rode. And one day I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go fast and just see what happens. Because I was trying to work at like I'd say 50%, just loping the pattern game, put his feet in the right spot, and it felt terrible. I mean, terrible. So one day I was like, okay, we're just gonna roll through here and see what happens. And he worked outstanding. And I was like, oh, well, you just weren't intrigued enough to try until we went and added intensity. So I think it does come down to a feel. But in general, I think when you get them consistent and it's easy, then you ask for more.
It's almost like one day you back in there and you can just tell that they're more prepared, more ready. And then they just fire different and run. You're like, holy cow, where did that come from? Sometimes on them because they're obviously it's different because they're chasing a moving object, but it's just crazy how they can go from like, just kind of coming along and doing well, and then all of a sudden the beast is woke, and then sometimes you got to bring them back to you, and you might get one going a little faster, maybe it's a little too fast, and you got to bring them back down and build them back up. So then that's just some of the fun of hauling them and bringing up those young horses.
Yeah, I think that's the most exciting part of the process is just watching them develop and figuring out how to help each one of them. It's exciting.
So on the other spectrum of things, speaking of feel, so say that you're with these horses all the time, you ride them all the time, you know what they should feel like as they go into a barrel. What are some of the signs that you might notice of one that's getting sore or possibly having an injury when you're in a run? Like when you're going into a barrel and they don't feel a certain type of way, what are you feeling that might tip you off like, hey, this horse is starting to get sore or have an issue?
I think one of the most common things, and it's kind of tricky because it's also a common training problem too. But I feel like if they're trying to beat you to the turn, meaning they're trying to start their turn too soon, or you get to the turn but you feel their hip kind of floating out instead of staying up under them driving. I think you feel that. As soon as I feel that, I'm like, I always go back and watch footage because cameras don't lie, and we live in a great day and age that we have the ability. Everybody has an iPhone, or there's some people have Droids, I guess. I don't know, but everybody has a phone, and you can take a video, watch it, dissect it, slow motion it, watch your hands, and really analyze: did you do something, or is it the horse? So if I feel one starting to kind of not feel the way I want, like if I feel their hip floating out, or I feel like they're beating me to the turn, I'll go back and watch the video and I'll say, did I do this, or was I trying to correct this? And take complete ownership. Like if you mess up, you got to own it, because you're the pilot of the plane. Like it's ultimately your responsibility. But then other things you'll see is sometimes some horses, they'll get sore behind, and then you'll start dropping on their front end a lot, and you'll feel them kind of stabbing their front end to the ground. Um, that's a pretty good sign. Or some horses, they'll get to the backside and then they'll start having a hesitated step when they should be coming back through their cell, or they just not leaving as hard. For rope horses, I do work for a bunch of guys that have some pretty elite rope horses. The one thing you can really tell with them is how are they scoring the box. And then if it's a head horse, ask how is it facing. And if it's a heel horse, ask is it quartering in the stop. Those are pretty good signs for those guys.
That's They have their own way of telling you, hey, there's something wrong. And and you nailed it. They like whether it's a gate issue in the barrels or a box issue and then the roping, that is some of the signs of like they're anticipating maybe something hurting as they fire out of there and or in the run. And whether it might be they don't like right in the corner on the steer is good and they're on their front end, or like you said, they don't face as sharp or something. I mean, definitely that's how they tell you that they're hurting. And I had a 4-year-old. I've told this story before on here. I had a 4-year-old that we were bringing him up and asking him a little bit more of him and stuff, and he was doing good. And then one day he was just awful in the box, and we'd had a hard practice a couple days before that, but I'm like, man, that's just not him. He just takes everything in stride and stuff. And so I went and had the chiropractor work on him and took him and roped on him a few days later, and he was like a statue in there. I mean, never had an issue. So
Yeah.
definitely spot on where to look for those issues in both the roping and the barrels. What about when one's like trying to run up the fence or not turning their barrels at all?
I think if it gets to that point, we've missed something for a hot minute before that. You know, at that point, I think the best thing to do is just kind of stop and reevaluate the whole situation. Usually, I think if you get one running down the fence or something like that, I think definitely you need to do a lameness exam or have your veterinarian do a lameness exam, and see if they're sore first. If you don't see anything there, then I would usually check them and see, like, ask a series of questions about their respiratory, like how do they recover, if they had a history of bleeding or anything like that, and go through that whole gamut of workup. Um, Ulcers can cause them to be a little sporadic, but usually they don't necessarily run down the fence with ulcers. They'll usually just be kind of, uh, I mean, I guess that's not entirely true. I've seen one run down the fence that had ulcers, but usually they're just more uncontent with life in general because they're constantly discomfortable.
Um, being able to tell if one's bleeding and then being able to figure out why one's bleeding. Talk about that a little bit. I mean, that's one of the things that to me is the hardest to understand.
So first, like before we really dive deep into the bleeding stuff, I think that a lot of that goes back to fitness. If those horses aren't used to working at that intensity, and then you're asking their lungs and heart to work that hard, and they're not conditioned for that, I think that sets yourself up for, I don't want to say a failure, but some problems. Um, Management, I think, also plays a big role in the respiratory system. Um, Not that this is feasible for everyone, but when you feed hay out of hay bags, you have the horse's head up in an unnatural position, and they're picking, and there's dust and stuff. I think it sets yourself up for a little bit of respiratory challenges that way too. And I'm not saying I don't ever use hay bags, because if they're standing tied to the trailer, I try to keep one in front of them. But at home, I try to feed them on the ground so their head's in a down natural position, so things would be going out instead of in their nose. Um, when it comes to the bleeding stuff, I think if a horse coughs consistently before they work um, hard, that makes me think more of a lower airway pathology, like inflammatory airway disease, asthma, just inflammation down the lungs. If you've had a horse that's bled, not all of them, but a lot of them have a very distinct wet cough afterwards. If you've heard it once, you can pretty easily recognize it. So if someone had a concern about their horse bleeding, I think scoping it is the first place to start. Ideally, after you run, let the horse pull out, get it scoped. If you're a lot of the bigger shows now, there's a veterinarian there working, and it's usually less than $100 to get one scoped, I think. And well, we live in Oklahoma and Texas. It's probably a little cheaper here than on the East Coast or the West Coast, but I think that's the first place to start, because it allows you to visualize the upper airway as well. You get a good look at the soft palate, the arytenoids, look for any upper airway pathology that can be contributing to a lower airway problem. And then you go down the trachea, and sometimes you'll see mucus in there, and that says, oh, well, we have inflammation down here for sure, but there won't be any blood. Sometimes they'll bleed. I think the next step, as far as really diving in to see, okay, this horse bled, why is it bleeding? Is a BAL, or a bronchial lavage. You run a tube down into their lungs. You take a small sample of the cells that are there. We put it on slides. We send it to a pathologist, and then they break down the proportion of neutrophils, macrophages, eosinophils, and kind of really break it down to say, okay, what's causing the pathology here? I think that's becoming increasingly more well practiced, because it's very simple. It doesn't take a lot of overhead or anything like that. So it's like, for even the ambulatory vet, it's pretty easy. I mean, I do them at the farm, no big deal. I just send them out the next day. And then from there, depending on what you get, then you can kind of really target your therapy plan for what you're addressing.
So, what are some of the common treatments that you might use? Besides Lasix, what are some ways that you might treat bleeder?
I think just getting to the root cause of it, because there are some horses that truly do just bleed from exercise induced pulmonary hemorrhage. But a lot of times there's contributing factors to it. And you see that when you do the BAL, like was there inflammation there and stuff like that. And then, you might treat them with, of course, prednisolone to help knock out some of the inflammation. If there's a lot of mast cells there, you might use a treatment of cromolyn, nebulizing that over a period of time, which can be a little expensive to stabilize the mast cells. I think the first and foremost, if you rule out if you can address any environmental changes or stuff like that, like the hay and maybe soak the hay, or just doing things simple, keeping good ventilation in barns when these horses are in stalls. If your horse has allergies, like run an allergy test. Like see, is there something in the environment that you can limit that's going to take out a natural state of inflammation? I think there's a lot of value to that too. We had one the other day, and the allergy test, the horse was like extremely allergic to Bermuda. Well, that's all they were feeding. I'm like, okay, well, we got to redirect here to what hay we're using, because it even though allergies don't directly create bleeding, it creates inflammation throughout the whole body. So if you have an athlete, that's not conducive to what you're trying to achieve anyway. So just looking at different things like that and going from there. As far as treating Lasix, treating bleeding, I think Lasix is a great place to start. It gets a bad rap sometimes because of the frequency we run these horses. I think if you're worried about electrolyte depletion because it's a potassium wasting diuretic, one thing we do quite a bit at the racetrack when we give Lasix, we give them electrolyte paste right then. By the time they're done running, they're ready to drink, and the electrolytes are already being replenished at that time. I think if you're rodeoing, and you're having to run a couple of days in a row, that's a great plan. If you're worried about the electrolytes, especially in the summer heat, I think it's a go-to for sure. There's a couple other medications and stuff out there for bleeding. There's all kinds of different approaches to it. Some people use sildenafil. Some people like Kentucky Red. It's a capillary bed stabilizer. There's a thing called Bleeder's Blend, and it's a combination of amino acids and such. That it's got arginine. It's like a vasodilator, so it helps dilate the blood vessels and stuff. So there's a bunch of different things you can try in combination to figure out what works best for your horse. As far as treating one after it bleeds, I think you got to consider antibiotics, because anytime we send off a culture to a lab, they grow on a blood agar media. So if you bleed and you're in the lungs and there's any bacteria there, it's the perfect environment to get a respiratory infection from that. So I like to treat those horses with antibiotics after they bleed. And if you have one that bleeds, ideally you need to let the lungs heal and clear out before you go back to full work on those horses.
How long does that typically take?
A lot of that, it depends on how bad they bled and if they've bled before. Each time a horse bleeds, you get a little bit of scar tissue from when it heals in the lungs, and that those capillaries and alveoli lose their pliability and elasticity. And I think this horse is more likely to bleed again. In general, like if it's just a horse that's not really bled before and it's mild, and we see it in say you scope it in the trachea and there's a small couple of spots of blood, but not like a stream or anything, I try to at least give them 14 days off with antibiotics if you can. And that's in the perfect world. I mean, I know there's situations where, like we have to figure out how to get through the next run, and then we're going to give them time off after that, if we can do it without compromising the health of the horse. Because this is how some people make their living, so they kind of have to figure out how to get around it. But there's other treatments too, as far as post bleeding. There's a product called ALV21 made by Hilltop Bio that's supposed to have regenerative therapies to it. There's all kinds of things you can nebulize, like albuterol and budesonide and different things that help treat the lungs and get the lungs as healthy as you can prior to work.
That's all really helpful, because I know that is a very common issue in the performance horse world, and especially the barrel horse world. People dealing with bleeders, and it's you know, it's way more common than what people may even realize.
Oh, for
So,
sure.
uh,